Critical Thinking and Testing by Kristen Milleville. All students in New York State are forced to take standardized tests throughout their education. These tests are required to pass classes, graduate, and will impact each child's success later in life. Therefore, shouldn't we evaluate the system that is shaping the education of children in New York State and be sure it prepares them for life after school? Therefore, the question I am attempting to answer in my research is teaching to the test an effective way of teaching students critical thinking skills in elementary and secondary education? I looked at the testing system in New York State because it is the most relevant to us as students, as many of us and our family members have been through it. There are many mixed views on this topic, but most educators and researchers believe that teaching to the test is ineffective. In my research, I have found that standardized tests and the teaching methods caused by them fail to teach students the critical thinking skills they need because of the narrow scope of each exam and the lack of individualized instruction in this system. Therefore, students are unprepared for the workplace. In order to properly answer this question and come to this conclusion, we must define the meaning of teaching to the test. According to the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, teaching to the test takes on two forms. These are item teaching and curriculum teaching. Item teaching occurs when a teacher teaches students in a way that addresses particular questions on a test, while curriculum teaching occurs when the teacher's entire curriculum is based off the curriculum covered on an exam. Either way, the student's learning is directed towards what will be covered on a test. Teachers direct a student's education toward what will be covered on standardized tests for a multitude of reasons. In New York State, students need to pass at least 6 Regents exams to graduate high school, as well as pass multiple ELA, social studies, science, and math exams in elementary and middle school. Therefore, with these high standards, it makes sense that educators would direct their attention to preparing students for these requirements as best as possible. On top of the large amount of requirements for students, teachers are held accountable for how each child performs. They are judged based on test scores and teaching evaluations, and the scores for each school are publicly reported. This creates even more pressure for teachers to be sure their students perform well on exams, causing teaching to the test to occur more. Although this system of education is widely used, many have doubts about its efficacy. As can be seen by the charts of progress on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the students of the United States have had little to no improvement in the areas of reading, writing, mathematics, and science over the past 20 years. Even though testing and teaching to the test are supposed to improve the performance of students, this data shows that the goal of testing isn't being achieved. Not only are students not improving, but a lack of enjoyment for what is being learned has also been found in students that are subject to this system. Test anxiety, cheating, and plagiarism are found in larger amounts than ever, as the pressure to pass exams increases in order to graduate and be successful in life. Specifically, this system impairs the development of critical thinking skills. Critical thinking is defined as the intellectual process of conceptualizing, analyzing, creating, and/or evaluating information gathered from observation and reasoning by the National Council for Excellence in Critical Thinking. New York State has stated that the aim of their standardized testing system is to assess the ability of students to critically think. Although New York State claims to be teaching students how to think critically, teachers don't seem to agree. In a study done in both urban and suburban school districts, there are a multitude of views on the subject. The teachers interviewed seemed to agree that teaching to the test allowed them to show their students how to think critically by teaching them how to decipher test questions. However, teachers also stated that the tests themselves allow no room for critical thinking because the test is so particular about what is considered a correct answer. If the state's exam instructs the students on exactly how to write, then critical thinking never occurs. Students are just telling them exactly what they would like to hear, which is a test of memorization, not critical thinking. Therefore, since critical thinking can be taught, but clearly isn't tested by New York State, it would be better to allow critical thinking to be taught without the tests that hinder it. For example, critical thinking can be learned from free writing and creative writing, as a student is given much more freedom to think about what is being written. Another issue is that critical thinking can sometimes be ignored in the non-individualized instruction caused by standardized testing. Schools attempt to be successful on tests instead of teaching critical thinking. This method also creates a lack of individualized instruction. According to one study, only 9% of the teachers surveyed gave individualized instruction to their students when having to teach to the test, and only 4% of teachers were able to prepare students who needed extra help. This form of instruction doesn't allow teachers to assess the way each student thinks critically. This lack of assistance and individualization has many repercussions. It causes children without assistance to not do well on exams, and it also creates issues for students of diverse backgrounds and skills. The content prepared for the exam usually isn't inclusive to students from different cultural backgrounds, and there is little want for individualization on the state exams. Since students must respond to a given topic, there is little room for creativity and critical thinking. How can every student be expected to think the same and understand the material in the same way when each of them is different? In conclusion, teaching to the test doesn't allow students to develop the critical thinking skills they need to survive the world beyond school. Based on evidence from multiple studies, this system fails to teach children the critical thinking skills they need because of the narrow scope of each exam and the lack of individualized instruction in this system. Therefore, we need to find alternatives to this system in order to teach students the critical thinking skills they need. Besides teaching children critical thinking through different modes of writing in the classroom, such as free and creative writing, we can also attempt to alter the system of standardized testing that is hurting children. By opting out of exams and protesting the current system, we can create awareness for the problem and eventually enact change.